We proudly welcome artist Samantha Sherry as our sponsor on the How to Love Lit podcast. Sam is a world-class artist specializing in animal portraits. We invite you to check out her work at samanthasherry.com. Tell her Christy and Garry sent you. Again, samanthasherry.com.
Christy Shriver. We're here to talk about books that have changed the world and have changed us.
And I'm Garry Shriver, and this is the How to Love Lit podcast. If you're listening to us for the first time, or you have been listening for a while, could you please take a second and scroll down to the bottom of your podcast app and hit the 5 stars? That helps us move up in the world.
And if you're thinking, I don't know if I want to give them 5 stars, rest assured, we've got a great discussion today about a great poet and short story writer. You will not regret it. You're gonna love it. He's a fan favorite, even though I have to be honest, he's not one of my personal favorites. No disrespect. It's on me. Today we're going to be talking about, and we'll be talking about him next week too, the one and only Edgar Allan Poe.
Should we have spooky music when you say that? I mean, I like Edgar Allan Poe, and I remember reading his stories in class as a teenager, and it's one of the few things I actually remember from my high school English classes, and the stories are very entertaining.
I know, and he's still super popular. All of my kids really like him, which is incredible because he's super hard to read. And I brought this up when we were talking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but I really don't like being scared. And Poe's scary. He is. His writings find humor even in the way that they're grotesque, and that's a lot of the reason why people like him. There's a range from gothic horror to true evil to the struggle between the rational and the crazy. And sometimes they're even sad, but mostly they're frightening. That's his contribution, and it's just not my genre. I have to respect the art. I tried to pick a couple of less creepy pieces for this series, though. I don't want to go down that road of burying people alive, and he can do that.
Well, in that case, thanks for taking one for the team for this special holiday series. And if you're listening to this in real time, we're doing Edgar Allan Poe this week and again next week because here in the United States, it's Halloween, one of the absolute biggest holidays of the year. And in most of Latin America, just south of us, it's followed up by the Day of the Dead. So it's all in the spirit of community, which in Memphis, to be honest, Halloween is more about community than anything else.
That is true. I know that's true.
Even in the year of COVID, houses are decorated and candy's been purchased, and everyone's in the spirit of getting outside and seeing your neighbors that you really don't see much during the year. And I would like to point out, it's the only time of the year where begging for food door to door is allowed once a year.
Well, at least it's socially acceptable as the best way to spend your evening.
Sure. I mean, you show up at somebody's house on March 12th and ask for food, it's not going to be well received.
No.
But at Halloween it is. Well, anyway, my son Ben and his wife Rachel, they live on a street where the decorations and the trick-or-treating is serious and competitive business. They have made a special COVID candy chute. So kids won't have to come all the way up to the door this year. So they're going to send candy down a chute they made out of plumbing pipes into the buckets of the trick-or-treaters. And, that's true innovation and effort for the season. So kudos to them. So, Christy, think of that instead of all the gore this week as we highlight the popular short story, The Cask of Amontillado. And next week, the very popular poem, The Raven. And per our usual, let's start with the life and times of a very interesting Edgar Allan Poe.
Yes, and I know we could talk really for an entire episode just about his life, but the Cask of Amontillado really is interesting. And so we are going to just highlight a few things from Poe's life. Then we'll talk about his mysterious death next week. Maybe we'll circle around and catch some more fun facts next Halloween. And maybe I even feel brave enough to tackle a creepier story. But this is a good one. Poe's life had so many self-sabotaging events, and it very much mirrors the chaos and gore that so often characterized his writing. Lots of people have questioned whether he was mentally ill. Garry, do you have any thoughts on that before we start to illustrate what I'm talking about?
Let me say that it goes without saying that you cannot, and I haven't seen any articles from any real legitimate sources that medically diagnose a person who is not alive. And since Poe died in 1849, it's nothing but speculation. At that time, people used the expression that someone was mad, but science has evolved significantly since those days, and we do understand a lot about what haunts us as humans. And from his writings, we can see a lot of this reflected in his world. And today there are treatments that can really help change the course of people's lives, like who back then would be condemned to just feeling lonely and estranged and depressed, and things that, Poe powerfully illustrates in his stories. And I will say that genius and insanity, some would say, is often entwined.
It is in Back to the Future, the mad scientist.
Okay. Opposite sides of a coin, if you will.
Yes.
There's many examples in history of amazing people who've stood out in their generation by being great artists, but who likely truly struggle with some shadow of mental illness. We obviously think of Van Gogh, but others like Mark Twain and Hermann Hesse and Ernest Hemingway and Virginia Woolf and Sylvia Plath are just a few writers that pop out immediately. And Poe seems to fall in this category. And Poe himself once said, when asked if he was crazy, interesting comment on himself, he says, "The question is not yet settled whether madness is or is not the loftiest intelligence, whether much that is glorious, whether all that is profound does not spring from disease of thought, from moods of mind exalted at the expense of the general intellect."
Wow. And that's actually really insightful for a person, if you think about it. He predates psychology.
I would like to point out, we've been saying for as long as we've been doing the podcast that the best writers were amateur psychologists. They did not really know what they were looking at, but they could describe it in writing. And, of course, people respond to that by saying, yeah, I know exactly what that person's like. And so I do want to go on and say, and be clear about this, there's no one that claims that mental illness promotes artistic talent. That's a notion we don't get into, and it's a generalization that trivializes some serious medical conditions. And it also discredits artistic genius that it's innate to other artists. And having said that, there does seem to be some correlation between some disorders and the ability to create incredible art, especially in artists who suffer from bipolar depression and bouts of hypomania. There's reason to believe that these artists, because of their hypomania, experienced enhanced rates of original thought, which is an interesting idea. They can experience unusual creative thinking, increased productivity. There's evidence to suggest that these artists also experienced increased fluency and frequency of thoughts. That's another great idea. They often tend to rhyme and use other sound associations, such as alliteration and musical things like that. And sometimes there's something called clang associations that can figure into that. And it seems that for some creative people who are already gifted, manic depressive illness provides an opportunity to actually produce art, because during these times, they don't require much sleep. They can focus intensely, vigorously, and even with great confidence of thought on their art. And I read one researcher who concluded that contradictory mood swings, when they are harnessed, enhance the artist's already innate ability to accurately see and reflect truth in nature and humanity in a way that those without these biological issues simply cannot even detect or feel, much less put into words.
Wow. So what you're saying is, if you are already a genius, an artistic genius, this disorder could actually help you enhance your genius into works that maybe you otherwise wouldn't have been able to do?
Yes, that is possible. and see the world from a perspective that others simply cannot see. So, I mean, that's one way of thinking about it. And of course, it goes without saying that any mental illness naturally comes with a lot of struggle. And Edgar Allan Poe, whether he suffered, as some suggest, from bipolar depression or not, he really seriously reflects great struggle. I mean, so much internal and external struggle, lots of it that he created himself. But a lot of it he did not. He was victimized, especially as a child.
That's true. His life, there's no doubt, was truly difficult. And under any circumstances, no matter how your brain is wired, anyone would struggle with these kinds of life traumas. What's remarkable is that he was able to hone this. In fact, if you want to say it this way, he was kind of honed in art, because he was born to actors in 1809, and apparently his mother was a fabulous actress. His dad, not so much, I guess pretty average on the stage, and off the stage, pretty much a schmuck. He abandoned them. His mother died before she turned 3, a death that he always remembered and spoke about. He talked about her vomiting blood and being carried away forever by horrible men dressed in black. So most scholars agree that this death, her death of tuberculosis, really changed him and in many ways informed a lot of his work. If you notice, lots of his stories carry with them this idea of being buried and being lost and then coming back, living versus dying. He had also an idealized image of who his mother was, and we can see, idealized women also in a lot of his writing.
Well, she was the first woman he lost, but loss characterized every relationship with a woman that he loved for the rest of his life.
I know, and that's just so sad. Even in high school, he had a close friend, and he loved his friend's mother, and she died of tuberculosis. He had a stepmother that he loved, Frances. So this couple, I guess I should say, Frances and John Allen, were this really wealthy couple that took him in after his mother died. But they never adopted him. He and the dad never got along. They were at odds for the rest of his life. But the mom and he were really close. And of course, she died tragically. Never mind the fact, later on, we're going to find out that his wife died. So that's a lot of loss.
When his real mother died and he was taken in by the Allens, Poe went to live in England with the Allens, and they sent him to boarding school. A very lonely place, it seems, for Poe himself. But he did hit the British literary scene at a great time. And during his education there, he was exposed to the great romantic writers, to Byron and to Shelley, and which are two that we've talked about. But he likely read a lot of romantic writers.
Well, I'm sure he did. And you can obviously see this from the Gothic influence in his work. In fact, lots of critics make fun of him because he's over the top with these kind of romantic notions and styles. And I will say, you can't deny that he kind of goes a lot out of control. We'll see this in The Raven. The man loves him some alliteration and rhyme. The American poet Ezra Pound said that Poe never used a noun without coupling it with an adjective, preferably vague and suggestive of horror, gloom, vastness, strangeness, and indefiniteness. Of course, all that's so true.
What a gift to be able to put a haunting word with a noun every time. And well, after this, we're going to read a real British Gothic tale with Wuthering Heights, and we can see for ourselves the comparisons.
True, and I know I'm getting ahead of myself talking about the unusual and really iconic style of Poe, because everybody knows Poe when they read him. He does have this real original style, whether you like it or not. He refers to a lot of bold colors, black, white, red. He uses long words on purpose, Latin type words, when he could use short words. For example, you would never be sick with Poe. You would be suffering from a malady. So that kind of thing is just all over the place.
Well, contrived right or not, he was clearly extremely bright. And when it came time, Poe managed to get admitted into the University of Virginia, where he studied French, Italian, Spanish, Latin, obviously has a gift for language.
Yes, for sure.
In every way. And he was doing really well until he self-sabotaged. And he got mad because Mr. Allen wouldn't give him enough money to live off of. So by way of getting back, he took up gambling and he ran up debts and got himself repeatedly drunk to the point he got thrown out of school.
And this is where we see that conundrum. Mr. Allen does something mean, but then in reaction, he does something more mean to himself. This was the first mess that he makes like this, but this isn't going to be the last. His relationship with alcohol is also particularly bad. He can't handle it. After leaving Richmond, he goes to the Army. And again, he starts off doing really, really well because he's really smart, and he moves up the rank to regimental sergeant major, which is as high as you can go as an enlisted person. So he goes to Mr. Allen and asks him to help him, and he does, and he gets him an appointment at the very prestigious West Point Military Academy.
For sure. But, of course, he does well until he self-sabotages again.
Again, because Mr. Allen won't give him money.
Well, he starts skipping classes, and he got himself court-martialed for gross neglect of duties.
Poor Poe. I mean, he just is lost, and we see this how he just floats around. He can never even find a place to settle down. He moves from city to city, and this is going to be what happens for the rest of his life. He's going to move to New York. He can't find a job there. Remember, this is one of those days in the old days where if you don't have food, well, if you don't have a job, you don't eat. There's no such thing as public assistance. So he reaches out to Mr. Allen. Mr. Allen, nothing. Which, by the way, Mr. Allen's really, really wealthy. I also want to point out that although I make it sound like he's floating around idly, he is writing, and he's producing a couple of books of poems. But you can't make money as a writer in those days. You can barely make it these days. Eventually, he moves to another city, Baltimore, to live with a relative, a woman by the name of Mrs. Clem, his aunt. And he gets a little bit of luck because he gets a short story published. People like it. It attracts the attention of a recognized novelist, a woman named Mrs. John P. Kennedy. And she gets him a gig as the assistant editor at the Southern Literary Messenger, which is a very impressive literary magazine. It's a great break. It's so good that he moves again to be able to take this job. So this time he brings Mrs. Clem and her daughter, Virginia, with him back to Richmond. So they have this new little family. He truly loves them. And I will say it's not but a few years before he marries Virginia, Mrs. Clem's daughter.
Which is one of those things people know about him that can gross them out. There really is not a satisfactory explanation for why a 27-year-old man would marry a 13-year-old girl.
I know. There's the bit of the yuck factor with the ages. And if it makes you feel better, they did lie. They tried to say she's 21, but no one believed them. I read some people that said you could barely believe she was 13. But it doesn't seem like they probably consummated the marriage. She just seemed like he wanted a family. And that worked out, except he couldn't be likable. He just can't be likable. He seems like actually a really jerky person. I mean, at this job, he's so arrogant and he's mean-spirited and he's always making enemies in the publishing business. He would lie to people about what he did at the magazine. He claimed to be way more important than he really was. Then in the magazine, he would lambast popular writers. He would insult the readers of the magazine itself. I mean, it's kind of funny. I mean, I read one quote where he said this. He's going to chide all Americans. He says, American readers, he chides us for liking a stupid book the better because sure enough, it's stupidity that's American. Well, he also published stories that were so horrifying. They were insulting. A lot of people know the famous story Berenice, where a man prepares to marry his cousin, but then actually ends up burying her alive and then digging her up again. It has stuff about teeth. It's so weird. It's shocking. And he does it totally on purpose.
Well, he was one of the first artists. And of course, this is the concept behind all social media clickbait, but in all kinds of TV shows now. But he understood that shocking and insulting gets you noticed, And you can't be famous if no one knows who you are. And Poe actually said that.
Well, I guess that is true. But Poe kept getting himself into so much trouble. He could not moderate. He would get fired, go somewhere else, get another job, insult people all over again. It's just this real self-sabotaging pattern.
He had such confidence that he was this amazing writer, and he had this incredible disdain for people who did not recognize his genius. And of course, we can argue if he was right or wrong about his talents, but history seems to agree with him. But regardless, he just couldn't get along.
Well, I want to stop here with his life and finish this crazy tale next week. But I did want to end with a very interesting insult that relates to this story that we're getting ready to read. So in 1840, Poe is back in Philadelphia, getting fired by yet one more boss. And Poe is indignant about this, as his usual demeanor when he gets fired. Yes. Mm-hmm. And he fires off a letter to his boss. And he says this: "If by accident you have taken it into your head that I am to be insulted with impunity, I can only assume that you are an ass. Nemo me impune lacessit," which is my poor attempt at reading Latin. Yeah. But this Latin phrase means this: no one insults me with impunity. Which is interesting because that is the inscription that we're going to read in the story, The Cask of Amontillado.
It's also an ironic turn of phrase because it seems there was absolutely no one in the literary world that Poe would not just blast and savage in review after review. And he was a huge insulter. He even accuses Henry David Longfellow of plagiarism, which from what I read, Poe wasn't above himself.
No, he wasn't.
He did it more than once. His whole professional life is picking one fight he can't win after another. I mean, just professional derailment for no real apparent reason. And he'd get a break, work really hard to make something happen, and do something so deliberate and horrible that it guaranteed failure. And a lot of this was peppered by alcoholic drinking binges that all that didn't do him any good.
True. Poe is a man that felt slighted by humanity. He was robbed, at least in his own mind. You can argue if he was robbed or not, but in his mind, he was robbed by the literary success that really was his birthright because of his true brilliance. There were those who were far worse than him, less talented than him, but they were getting more results than him, more money, more fame. It's no wonder that by 1846, he would write what would become one of his most famous stories. And it's a story that really channels this feeling we've all experienced, if we're honest, from time to time, when someone who is lesser than us becomes more successful and they don't recognize that their success is not earned. This person looks down on you. They have an inflated sense of themselves. And in this story, that kind of person gets what they deserve. At least in Poe's mind, they get the Cask of Amontillado.
Well, like I said, this is the first story of his that I ever remember reading.
Well, it's a great one for a lot of reasons, and we're going to read the whole thing. But before we do, I want to give you some of the literary things to look for when you read it, because beyond channeling our desire for revenge, it's a very clever story. Poe had these rules of what he thought constituted a great story, and A Cask of Amontillado follows all of them. His first rule for a short story is that you should be able to sit down and read the whole thing in one setting. The second rule is that it should have a unity of impression. In other words, everything in the story needs to lead you to what one thing that author is trying to do. He also thinks that a tale should be self-sufficient. It should contain within itself all that is required for its comprehension. And he does this. He's going to pack it all in. Every detail leads to something. Every word is intentional. Every name is symbolic. Every piece of dialogue is ironic. And every action takes us deeper and deeper into his crazy reality. So this is what I mean. Let's begin with the title. It's a pun. Amontillado is a kind of sherry, which is a kind of wine. I'd never heard of it before this story, but it's Spanish. And a cask means a case. So at one level, a cask of Amontillado is obviously like a case of this particular wine. However, it's a pun. Monte, is another form of the word mountain. Cask is a shortened way to say casket. So it's a casket from a mountain.
Very clever.
I know, and everything in this story is like that and very deliberate. The setting is vague. We think it's Italy because of the language. Maybe Rome, we'll assume that, but it doesn't really matter. Some people think it's France. But it's obviously during Carnival. And being from Brazil, I know a little bit about Carnival. Carnival is a 3-day holiday. It's a quasi-religious holiday. You're supposed to dress up, party really hard, act the fool for the last 3 days before Lent, because in the Catholic tradition of Christianity, you're supposed to straighten up during Lent, the 40 days before Easter. And Easter, of course, in all of Christendom is the most holy day in the Christian faith. The year is kind of vague. There's some clues. Montresor is a Mason, and that only existed in the 1730s upwards. He's wearing this roquelaire, which is this fashionable thing during the 1700s. There's a couple of other clues that let you know that it's probably in the second half of the 1700s. It's not obviously super important to pinpoint the year. The names, it's more interesting. They're coded. Fortunato obviously means fortunate, which this dude is quite unfortunate.
Hence the irony.
Yes, but he's also fortunate, and that's part of the reason Montresor hates him. He apparently considers himself to be better than Montresor. He's a better wine connoisseur, although he doesn't know anything we're going to figure out, because he doesn't know that Amontillado is a sherry, which I wouldn't have known that either, but I'm not of Italian lineage and a wine connoisseur. And we know it because he makes fun of another guy named Lucrezi, who says, the guy doesn't know Amontillado from sherry. And it's the same thing. But anyway, this all informs the reader that Fortunato is stupid. He's stupid and he pretends that he's some blue-blooded aristocrat, but his crest isn't very impressive. He doesn't know how to look dignified. He's wearing a stupid jester costume and he looks the fool. Literally, he's wearing an outfit of a fool. And of course, Carnival is about dressing up. But we all know, because we've been to those parties, that dressing up is a trick. You're supposed to not look like a doofus. And there's always that person that doesn't pull that off. Well, Fortunato is that guy. He doesn't know how to dress up without looking like a fool. Literally a fool. All the details here suggest that he has gotten really lucky in life. And he's mistaken this luck for his innate genius and talent, and he looks down on people that are better than him. Specifically, Montresor. Now, Montresor means my treasure. He's the one with the nice heritage. He's the one that understands wine. He's the one who should be getting some respect.
So as we read, are we to look for all the hidden ironies?
That's it, exactly.
Okay.
And I may stop and interrupt you because sometimes I just can't resist, but I'm going to try to refrain because I know that can be annoying. But there's a lot in this story. Everything is based on the irony. Everything that Montresor says when he says things like, I wouldn't want you to die from a cold. Well, we know that that's true.
That's exactly what he's up to.
And there's that kind of stuff all the way through. Even the first sentence is something to notice because it's a thesis statement, like in an essay. The narrator is going to clearly claim this crazy primitive honor code. The idea being that if somebody insults you boldly enough, you should not only get them back, but you must do it without getting caught. Montresor is telling his story half a century after he commits this murder. He's not regretful. He's proud. It's been an artful revenge. Fortunato is a fool who dared to condescend to someone better than him, and Montresor had to put up with his arrogance, and he did so for long enough. And when we get to the part where Montresor points out the coat of arms, notice that it's a human foot crushing a snake. From Montresor's perspective, this is the story of a man getting what's coming to him. And not for any specific bad thing either, but for not knowing his place. The ultimate insult worthy of this ultimate punishment.
Ooh, harsh.
Let's begin.
The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as I best could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You, who so well know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitely settled, but the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. It must be understood that neither by word nor deed had I given Fortunato cause to doubt my goodwill. I continued, as was my wont, to smile in his face, and he did not perceive that my smile now was at the thought of his immolation. He had a weak point, this Fortunato. Although in other regards he was a man to be respected and even feared, he prided himself upon his connoisseurship in wine. Few Italians have the true virtuoso spirit. For the most part, their enthusiasm is adopted to suit the time and the opportunity to practice imposture upon the British and Austrian millionaires. In painting and gimmery, Fortunato, like his countrymen, was a quack. But in the matter of old wines, he was sincere. In this respect, I did not differ from him materially. I was skillful in the Italian vintages myself, and bought largely whenever I could. It was about dusk one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season that I encountered my friend. He accosted me with excessive warmth, for he had been drinking much. The man wore motley. He had on a tight-fitting parda-stripped dress, and his head was surmounted with the conical cap and bells. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should never have done wringing his hand. I said to him, "My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you are looking today. But I have received a pipe of wine that passes for Amontillado, and I have my doubts."
How? Amontillado? A pipe? Impossible. And in the middle of the carnival?
I have my doubts, and I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. You were not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain.
Amontillado?
I have my doubts.
Amontillado?
And I must satisfy them.
Amontillado?
As you are engaged, I'm on my way to Lucrezi. If anyone has a critical turn, it is he. He will tell me.
Lucrezi cannot tell Amontillado from sherry.
And yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own.
Come, let us go.
Whither?
To your vaults.
My friend, no, I will not impose upon your good nature. I perceive you have an engagement. Lucrezi.
I have no engagement. Come.
My friend, no, it is not the engagement, but the severe cold with which I perceived you are afflicted. The vaults are insufferably damp. They are encrusted with niter.
Let us go, nevertheless. The cold is merely nothing. Amontillado, you have been imposed upon. And as for Lucrezi, he cannot distinguish sherry from Amontillado.
Thus speaking, Fortunato possessed himself of my arm, and putting on a mask of black silk and drawn a roquelaire closely about my person, I suffered him to hurry me to my palazzo. There were no attendants at home. They had absconded to make merry in the honor of the time. I had told them that I should not return until the morning, and had given them explicit orders not to stir from the house. These orders were sufficient, I well knew, to ensure their immediate disappearance, one and all, as soon as my back was turned. I took from their sconces 2 flambeaux, and giving one to Fortunato, bowed him through several suites of rooms to the archway that led into the vaults. I passed down a long and winding staircase, requesting him to be cautious as he followed. We came at length to the foot of the descent, and stood together upon the damp ground of the catacombs of the Montresors. The gait of my friend was unsteady, and the bells upon his cap jingled as he strode.
The pipe.
It is further on, but observe the white webwork which gleams from these cavern walls. He turned toward me and looked into my eyes with 2 filmy orbs that distilled the rheum of intoxication.
Niter?
Niter, I replied. How long have you had that cough? My poor friend found it impossible to reply for many minutes.
It is nothing.
Calm, I said with decision, we will go back. Your health is precious. You're rich, respected, admired, beloved. You are happy as once I was. You are a man to be missed. For me, it is no matter. We will go back. You will be ill, and I cannot be responsible. Besides, this is Lucrezi.
Enough. The cough is a mere nothing. It will not kill me. I will not die of a cough.
True, true. And indeed, I had no intention of alarming you unnecessarily, but you should use all proper caution. A draught of this medic will defend us from the damps.
And you notice he won't die of a cough.
Here I knocked off the neck of a bottle, which I drew from a long row of its fellows that lay upon the mold. Drink, I said, presenting him the wine. He raised it to his lips with a leer. He paused and nodded to me familiarly with his bells jingle. He raised it to his lips with a leer. He paused and nodded to me familiarly while his bells jingled.
I drink to the buried that repose around us.
And I to your long life. He again took my arm and we proceeded.
These vaults are extensive.
The Montressors were a great and numerous family.
I forget your arms.
A huge human foot d'or on a field azure. The foot crushes a serpent rampant whose fangs are embedded in the heel.
And the motto?
Nemo me impune licessit.
And remember, that's the line that he said from the boss.
And I probably said it as improperly in Latin as you did earlier.
Good, he said.
The wine sparkled in his eyes and the bells jingled. My own fancy grew warm with the medic. We had passed through long walls of piled skeletons with casks and puncheons intermingling into the inmost recesses of the catacombs. I paused again, and this time I made bold to seize Fortunato by an arm above the elbow. The nitre, I said, see, it increases. It hangs like moss upon the vaults. We are below the river's bed. The drops of moisture trickle among the bones. Come, we will go back ere it is too late. Your cough.
It is nothing. Let us go on. But first, another draught of the Medoc.
I broke and reached him a flecken of de Grave. He emptied it at a breath. His eyes flashed with a fierce light. He laughed and threw the bottle upwards with a gesticulation I did not understand. I looked at him in surprise. He repeated the movement, a grotesque one.
You do not understand.
Not I.
Then you are not of the Brotherhood.
How?
You are not of the Masons.
Yes.
You? Impossible. A Mason?
A Mason.
A sign.
It is this, I answered, producing from beneath the folds of my roquelaire a trowel.
You jest. But let us proceed to the Amontillado.
Be it so, I said, replacing the tool beneath the cloak and again offering him my arm. He leaned upon it heavily. We continued our route in search of the Amontillado. We passed through a range of low arches, descended, passed on, and descending again, arrived at a deep crypt, in which the foulness of the air caused our flambeau rather to glow than flame. At the most remote end of the crypt, there appeared another less spacious. Its walls had been lined with human remains, piled to the vault overhead in the fashion of the great catacombs of Paris. 3 sides of this interior crypt were still ornamented in this manner. From the 4th side, the bones had been thrown down and lay promiscuously upon the earth, forming at one point a mount of some size. Within a wall thus exposed by the displacing of the bones, we perceived a still interior crypt or recess, in depth about 4 feet, in width 3, in height 6 or 7. It seemed to have been constructed for no special use within itself, but formed merely the interval between 2 of the colossal supports of the roof of the catacombs, and was backed by one of their circumscribing walls of solid granite. It was in vain that Fortunato, uplifting his dull torch, endeavored to pry into the depths of the recess. Its termination, the feeble light did not enable us to see. Proceed, I said. Herein is the Amontillado. As for Lucrezi...
He's an ignoramus,
interrupted my friend as he stepped unsteadily forward, while I followed immediately at his heels. In an instant he had reached the extremity of the niche, and finding his progress arrested by the rock, stood stupidly bewildered. A moment more, and I had fettered him to the granite. In its surface were 2 iron staples, distant from each other about 2 feet. Horizontally, from one of these depended a short chain, from the other a padlock. Throwing the links about his waist, it was but the work of a few seconds to secure it. He was too much astounded to resist. Withdrawing the key, I stepped back from the recess. "Pass your hand," I said, "over the wall. You cannot help feeling the nitre. Indeed, it is very damp. Once more let me implore you to return." "No, then I must positively leave you. But I will first render you all the little attentions in my power."
"The Amontillado!"
"True," I replied, "the Amontillado." As I said these words, I busied myself among the pile of bones of which I have before spoken. Throwing them aside, I soon uncovered a quantity of building stone and mortar. With these materials, and with the aid of my trowel, I began vigorously to wall up the entrance of the niche. I had scarcely laid the first tier of the masonry when I discovered that the intoxication of Fortunato had in great measure worn off. The earliest indication I had of this was a low moaning cry from the depth of the recess. It was not the cry of a drunken man. There was then a long and obstinate silence. I laid the second tier, and the third, and the fourth, and then I heard the furious vibration of the chain. The noise lasted for several minutes, during which that I might hearken to it with the more satisfaction. I ceased my labors and sat down upon the bones. When at last the clanking subsided, I resumed the trowel and finished without interruption the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th tier. The wall was now nearly upon a level with my breast. I again paused, and holding the flambeau over the masonwork, threw a few feeble rays upon the figure within. A succession of loud and shrill screams, bursting suddenly from the throat of the chained form, seemed to thrust me violently back. For a brief moment I hesitated. I trembled. Unsheathing my rapier, I began to grope with it about the recess, but the thought of an instant reassured me. I placed my hand upon the solid fabric of the catacombs and felt satisfied. I reapproached the wall. I replied to the yells of him who clamored. I re-echoed. I aided. I surpassed them in volume and in strength. I did this, and the clamorer grew still. It was now midnight, and my task was drawing to a close. I had completed the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th tier. I had finished a portion of the last and the 11th. There remained but a single stone to be fitted and plastered in. I struggled with its weight. I placed it partially in its destined position. But now there came from out the niche a low laugh that erected the hairs upon my head. It was succeeded by a sad voice which I had difficulty in recognizing as that of the noble Fortunato. The voice said,
A very good joke indeed. An excellent jest. We will have many a rich laugh about it at the palazzo. Over our wine.
The Amontillado.
Yes, the Amontillado. But isn't it not getting late? Will not they be awaiting us at the palazzo? The Lady Fortunato and the rest? Let us be gone.
Yes, I said, let us be gone.
For the love of God, Montresor.
Yes, for the love of God. But to these words I hearkened in vain for a reply. I grew impatient. I called aloud, Fortunato! No answer. I called again, Fortunato! No answer still. I thrust a torch through the remaining aperture and let it fall within. There came forth in return only a jingling of the bells. My heart grew sick. It was the dampness of the catacombs that made it so. I hastened to make an end of my labor. I forced the last stone into its position. I plastered it up. Against the new masonry, I re-erected the old rampart of the bones. For the half of a century, no mortal has disturbed them. In pace requiescat. Pretty gruesome story.
Well, I don't know if I should say peace out on that note.
Oh, I don't know. But thanks for being with us today. Check us out on our How to Love Lit podcast page, our Facebook page, our pod page, and our Instagram page.
And for real, peace out.